How lovely to be here with you on Valentine's Day. Thank you everybody for coming. I thought what I might start with is just a little background about why it is that I care so much about this particular topic. And there's probably two core reasons for why I care a lot about this. One is the fact that I've seen what happens when we don't get it right. What happens when the safety nets and the support structures in our communities are not strong enough to be able to protect and empower and enable every young person to succeed. The other thing is that in my entire life and career, I've not once had an experience working with a young person that I believe doesn't want to learn and doesn't want to thrive and doesn't want to succeed. And the challenge for any strong, thriving society is really to get this right so that every single person, no matter what their socioeconomic circumstance, their cultural circumstance, their religious circumstance, no matter what, they're able to thrive and to succeed. There's a couple of individuals that have consistently inspired me through my work as a youth worker and my work in schools. And I grew up and, like a lot of people, around the age of 14, 15, 16, start to ask a lot of questions about the world and about what type of world do I want to be in, what do I want to do, and what type of pathway should I follow. And I was always struck that the people that cared about me the most had a very strict, fixed idea of what success would look like. And they incorporated a lot of the big public institutions in this great state. I was going to finish at high school, I was going to go to university, I was going to have this entire path for me mapped out. And instead, when I was 15, I started doing volunteer work, working with young people that had a disability. And that work stunned me for two reasons. One is that I saw the level of judgment and expectation that was put on a portion of the community that I was growing up in. And I felt like that was a really different judgment and set of expectations than what was put on me. And I didn't think that was right. And I started to develop a much broader sense of what success meant and what it looked like. The other thing that I was exposed to very early on was what advocacy looks like and feels like. And working in environments where some individuals couldn't defend their own rights for themselves and were reliant on other advocates and supporters doing that alongside them. And I knew very early on, from 15 or 16, working within the disability community, that the way that a portion of the community were being treated because they had a disability was not going to be dissimilar to how a whole lot of other groups within the community were treated also. What fascinated me was the response of many of the institutions and the people within them to different groups within the community. And what I'll do today is argue very strongly that I think for some, our public institutions get this right. And for some, they don't. And that gap is inexcusable. What I want to do is walk through some examples of public institutions in Australia and talk a little about my direct observation and what I have come to believe to be true about what it is that every young person in this country deserves. And I guess the point I'd like to start at is to say, in 2013, what promises are we willing to make to every single young Australian? Are we willing to promise them a life that is enriching, that is safe, and allows the full potential of every one of them to be realised? And if that's what we are genuinely willing to promise every young person, are we confident that today's public institutions are able to deliver this? And again, what I'll suggest to you is that what we currently have on offer in way of public institutions in this country is not enough. And near enough is no longer good enough. I'll suggest that too many systems and institutions lock young people out and do not let them in. And I think a good place to launch from here is to look at a couple of definitions. So technically, the concept of a public institution is a structure or organisation that's paid for with public funds and is controlled by the state. Such organisations span areas such as health, child protection, all levels of education, as well as other services and facilities such as libraries and recreation centres. In the context of this discussion, I'll refer to failure as anything less than a society that leaves no one behind. There is a separate argument that we might want to have one day about whether our population should be dependent on the support and intervention from public institutions. However, for the purpose of this discussion, I'll assume that such institutions can and should provide a safety net and a platform from which all young people can thrive. Finally, I'd like to paint a bit of a picture for you about who these young people actually are. And as I share this information, I'd ask you to consider what this really is telling us about the performance of our public institutions and about our society as a whole. The data that I'll share with you is largely from 2010, and if it's not, I'll make that clear to you. So a young person typically refers to someone aged between 12 and 24. They make up 20% of the Australian population and dominate 28% of households. And I use the term dominate quite intentionally for any of you that are living with a teenager or a 20-something that won't leave home. 66% of 12 to 19-year-olds live at home with two parents, and a further 20% live with one. 1 in 5 young Australians was born overseas. Young people contribute approximately $50 billion to the gross national income every year. Alarmingly, suicide is the leading cause of death for young people aged between 15 and 24. 1 in 100 young people report being homeless. Young people are more likely to become victims of violent crimes, including sexual offences and assaults, and are far, far less likely to report it than individuals that are older. 1 in 3 young people who have engaged in sexual intercourse reported having unwanted sex at some point in their lives, and only 2/3 of sexually active young people use protection. 1 in 10 young people are same-sex attracted. 1 in 3 are an unhealthy weight, either too heavy or underweight. Indigenous young people are far less likely to be enrolled and retained within our education systems. Almost half of Indigenous young people aged between 15 and 19 are not enrolled in any type of education setting, compared with 25% of non-Indigenous young people in this age group. 1 in 10 young people report having a disability or a long-term condition that restricts their daily lives. These young people are often less likely to finish their education or engage in permanent employment. They are likely to spend less time per week with friends and more time alone, increasing their risk of social exclusion. They're also significantly more likely to be the victim of a violent crime. Year 12 completion rates for school students living in the 3 poorest communities of Australia is approximately 55%. Compared with 80% in the 3 wealthiest communities. Young males are at greater risk than females of violence and of substance abuse. 80% of 18 to 25-year-olds are enrolled to vote, compared with 95% of the rest of the population. Most young people identify as being Christian, and by most I'm 58%, and most Christians were either Catholics or Anglicans. Interestingly, the largest non-Christian religious affiliation is Islam. 1 in 3 of all young people experience moderate to high psychological distress every year, and around 160,000 aged between 16 and 24 live with depression. The gap in terms of any number of health and well-being indicators for young people living in a rural community is far more severe than those in a metropolitan area. And too often we grossly underestimate the capacity and the ability of young people in rural settings, quite often because they don't fit into the same measures and metrics and structures as young people in a city. And lack of attendance or attainment at school in a rural setting doesn't take into account the fact that a 17-year-old might be running a 500-hectare farm turning over $2 million a year, and we don't value that as learning. What's not included in the picture that I've tried to paint for you is the creative genius that lies within each and every young person in this country. What's not included here in these statistics that I've shared are stories about why so many young people have fallen through the cracks in our systems and in our public structures, and what's missing are the stories about those that have saved them. This is not to say that our public institutions do not serve many or most. But again, I ask you, is that good enough? Are we willing to settle with that? And what more should we be thinking about doing? In 2013, the world is a different and rapidly changing place. The way we acquire information, the way we connect with others, and the way we imagine ourselves in this world has changed forever. Arguably, the structures and systems that served us in the last century will not serve us in the next. Other elements of our society are embracing this pace of change and are keeping up, or they're leading the way. Many of our public institutions are not. The mark of a strong, prosperous society will always be the way in which we treat those in the most need. And what our nation is in the greatest need of is a generation of learners, lovers, and I say that particularly on this day, innovators and humanitarians. People that have the opportunity to thrive and to transform Australia from what it is today to what it should be. To not give every child and young person the opportunity to have a superb education denies our nation the chance to ever achieve its full potential. While keeping young people safe, secure and supported are important pillars of our public institutions, it's not enough. There are just over 3.5 million students in 9,435 schools in Australia. 77% of young women and 70% of young men are in full-time education. 3.5 million young people in Australia at school is not a small part of our national population. It's significant. And quite frankly, we can't afford the social, economic, cultural or environmental impact of not getting the best from each and every one of them. At various times over the past couple of hundred years, every state and territory in Australia has passed an Act of Parliament that enshrines public education. Free, accessible, secular education to which all are entitled. But perhaps that should read most, or just some. The reality is that over time it has become easier to turn young people away, not just from our schools, but from many, many public institutions. Sometimes it's just too hard. Sometimes the needs young people have don't fit squarely into the bureaucratic pathways and the options that many of our public institutions offer. In an era of competition within and between institutions, we're measured on our capacity to generate outcomes. And it's hard to take on young people, clients, cases, whatever you might call them, that don't fit, or who distort our data, or who are somebody else's responsibility. And until we invest adequately in early childhood education, early support for parents, and a holistic model of education that really values the art and the science of teaching and learning, we'll always rely on the public purse to fund what has gone wrong. Can you believe that in the United States, for example, they spend 6 times more on prisons than on education? This is not intended to sound like a naive, idealistic, hard-left view of what is possible, although I'm often accused of being all of those things and more. It's a personal acknowledgement that in 15 years working directly with young people, often in extremely different and difficult circumstances, I've never met a single one who cannot learn and who doesn't want to succeed. The fact they don't always realise this themselves is the real injustice. Disability Discrimination Commissioner Graham Innes talks about the soft burden of low expectation carried by those with a disability. We often don't expect those with a disability to be excellent, to be leaders, and our society misses out because of this. The Country Education Project in Victoria is another outstanding example of where we can get our perceptions and our institutions really wrong and aligned in the wrong areas. When a number of senior secondary school students from some of the most remote and isolated schools in the state came together late last year to share their greatest challenges and insights, it might surprise you that the single greatest concern they raised had nothing to do with access to technology, access to jobs, access to higher education. The single greatest thing that concerned them was low expectation. Low expectation that they had of themselves, their peers, and low levels of expectation that public institutions that they had access to had of them. It's my strongest possible belief that providing a free, secular, high-quality system of public education is the single most important investment any nation will make in its future. To deliver this well is complex, expensive, and requires a re-evaluation of how incredibly politicised education has become today. And quite frankly, this public institution is far too important to be dominated by politics. There are now so many compromises and counterintuitive decisions that have been made. This important institution continues to miss out and is forced to do more with less. The promise we should be making to every young person in 2013 is that their time at school will genuinely prepare them for a rapidly changing future. The skills most valued by business and industry continue to be out of step with what many schools are explicitly offering. And equally, the complex social challenges our world will continue to face will require bold new responses that come from being able to engage and mobilise people around knowledge and around action. One of the greatest challenges is making a transition from the education young people get to the education young people deserve, and deciding how we will measure both personal success and the success of the broader community. Our country, and in particular our education structures and our public institutions, are completely obsessed with high-stakes standardised testing, which is a little strange given that there is absolutely no evidence anywhere that more standardised testing makes any positive impact on learning. The danger here is that our schools are avoiding what is difficult to teach and avoiding what is difficult to measure. And this is in the interest of no one. We're caught in the middle of trying to work out if we measure what we value or if we value what we measure. And we don't place enough value on understanding the unique talent and capacity and ability and passion that lies within all of the young people in this country. We claim our institutions celebrate difference, yet most public institutions tend to channel young people through the same system, at the same pace, at the same time, to those who just happen to be born in the same year. Furthermore, unlike almost any other nation, close to 40% of government investment in school education is diverted to private and Catholic counterparts, both of which have the capacity to discriminate, turn young people away, and in the case of when public responsibilities are outsourced to the Catholic system, they're exempt from adhering to standard anti-discrimination laws when it comes to recruiting staff. I have many issues with this, the largest being the message it sends to young people that are members of the LGBTI community, sending a message constantly that they are not equal. The Howard, Rudd and Gillard governments have each invested close to $500 million in providing Christian chaplains in secular schools. And there is not a single public institution in Australia that could not have done more with a small injection of $500 million. And if any of you are here representing public institutions, I'm sure you'll furiously agree with me. This is another example of where peripheral political spending is done at the expense of public institutions acting in the public good. And the 2 points I'm trying to make here, one is that we should enable public institutions to be all that they need to be, and secondly, we should resource them accordingly. Too many young people in this country have a feeling that they have failed. And the real question is, have they failed or have we failed them? Public institutions do not serve the public, they create the public. They are the heart, soul, and the opportunity for our nation to be great. They should pick us up when we've fallen down and accelerate and applaud our efforts. This is most important for each and every young person in Australia, and we cannot afford to leave a single one behind. In 2013, the needs of our communities are complex and require resources and support far beyond what any single public institution can offer. One of the greatest challenges is related to how public institutions collaborate with each other, share resources, and embrace collective responsibility. An excellent example of this, where public education and public health intersect, is the Education Institute at the Royal Children's Hospital here in Melbourne. This is a superb cross-sectoral model that demonstrates first and foremost that every young person is a learner, regardless of whatever health condition they might be dealing with. And secondly, it points to the fact that learning does occur everywhere. The hospital has truly been transformed into a place where learning occurs everywhere, and where children and young people with the chronic health conditions are the ones that benefit the most. The commitment of these two public institutions to ensure that young people are not lost through the cracks at a time of competing priorities is enormously significant. And this is a challenge that must be set and accepted by all public institutions. Working together, understanding the unique needs and talents of every young person is absolutely critical. And it's far too easy to judge and to assume. We need to look past what we see and hear about young people today and hear the call for change that is ringing so loudly. Hear the call that young people today are passionate, creative and scared. Hear the call that they're dealing with an overload of information, stimulation and decisions that make them grow up faster than many people would like. The rates of depression, suicide and believing they are not all that they can be should be the greatest alarm bells that we have, only enhanced by all of the knowledge that we've got today about what really does create optimal, healthy environments in which young people can live and can learn. This is not necessarily about doing more, it's about doing better. Being flexible, being open, being creative, responsive and letting them in. How does a grade 4 teacher at the Bazuki School, which is a public primary school in Indonesia, know that little grade 4 boy, Barack Hussein Obama, will become President of the United States? How does a Year 8 teacher at Unley High School know that Julia Gillard will become Prime Minister? How does a grade 6 teacher at Stawell West Primary School know that the bright, funny girl in the wheelchair with osteogenesis imperfecta, Stella Young, will become one of the greatest advocates, journalists and comedians that this country will ever know? Do our public institutions do enough to let young people in, to let them thrive, to let them all be all they can be? And the real question to leave you with is, what do we do, or what happens if we miss out on doing this for every young person? Poet Edwin Markham first wrote, "Heretic rebel, a thing to flout. He drew a circle that shut me out. But love and I had the wit to win. We drew a circle and took him in." May we always see the potential and passion in young Australians, and at every opportunity, may we let them in. Thank you.